Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Freeman Air and Space Institute. My name's Aaron Dawson, a PhD candidate with FASI, and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session. There has never been a more urgent time to talk about drones and aerial warfare, and from the battlefield to the budget spreadsheet, drones are no longer a future or niche capability. They are the front line. Just last night, Russia and Ukraine exchanged massive drone strikes in what has become an almost nightly feature of a war transformed by uncrewed systems. Ukraine aims to produce 4.5 million drones domestically this year alone, considering drones to be a tool of national survival. And the UK is responding in kind. As part of the Ukraine Defence Contact Group just last week, the UK pledged £350 million, including funding for hundreds of thousands of drones to support Ukraine's fight. And in the Chancellor's spring statement last month, Rachel Reeves ring-fenced at least 10% of the defence budget for drones and AI, signalling how central these systems will be to the country's defence posture. And the recent announcement of £200 million in a state-owned microchip facility in the UK reflects other anxieties. Are we prepared for the industrial demands and indeed the inevitable losses that come with scaling attritable drones? These developments sit alongside two major strategic publications within the past 14 months. The UK's Defence Drone Strategy, which commits £4.6 billion to uncrewed systems over the next decade, and the RAF's Autonomous Collaborative Platform Strategy, a blueprint to guide the force's future combat air mix. A year on from these strategies, are words being matched by action? Is the money flowing fast enough and to the right places? With a new National Armaments Director about to take the helm and defence innovation structures being reformed, these questions are no longer theoretical. They are strategic imperatives. Indeed, we may be entering the twilight of the piloted combat aircraft. Future programs like GCAP are already being talked about as optionally uncrewed potentially, and they could be the last, in any case, to feature a human in the cockpit. In their place, drones ranging from small FPVs to Protector and everything in between promise agility, mass, and affordability. But what do you think? Should drones replace or supplement crewed aircraft in future warfare? FASI is actively engaging with these debates with new research from David Wetham and colleagues, most recently on the ethics of using drones for casualty evacuation. Dominika Kunatova, one of our panelists today, who's written about the challenges drones pose to Western militaries, and a shameless plug for a paper Alesh Nadal and I have just written on the RAF's shifting approach towards small drones. This webinar then isn't just timely, it's essential. To unpack all that and more, we're fortunate to have three outstanding panelists with us today. First of all, Dr. Keith Deere is the CEO and founder of the AI strategy startup CASI. Before that, he was at Fujitsu launching their Center for Cognitive Technologies, having been an expert advisor to the Prime Minister on defense and an RAF intelligence officer. His Air Force colleague, Air Marshal retired Greg Bagwell, served for 36 years in the RAF, including as Deputy Commander Operations. Greg flew the Tornado and F-18 on operations and now holds senior leadership roles, including President of the Air and Space Power Association. Dr. Dominika Kunatova is an independent research scientist and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, specializing in the military applications of emerging technologies, drone warfare, and autonomy. A former NATO official and senior researcher at ETH Zurich, Dominika has, as mentioned, a forthcoming paper published by FASI tomorrow on the challenges Western militaries face in adapting to drone warfare. So in terms of the format for today's webinar, each of our panelists will deliver a 5-minute opening statement. I'll then kick off discussion between the panelists before bringing in audience Q&A. And I'm really eager to get as many of your voices in the debate as possible and as soon as possible. So please do submit your questions at any time via the Q&A function. We will conclude with a 1-minute closing reflection from each of our panelists at the end. So again, we're aiming for a lively, engaging session on drones in future air warfare. And to kick us all off, Keith, over to you for the first opening statement. Thank you.
Aaron, thanks very much. I'm going to start by defining, at the very least, what I'm talking about when we talk about drones. So, as Aaron said, not just quadcopters, not just the things you can buy in the hobby store, but we have had automated A-10s created by DARPA in the past. We have people working and the entirely feasible, fully automated Boeing 737s for air transport or air logistics. And until it joined the GCAP program, Japan was working on a fully uncrewed FX fighter as its next generation combat aircraft. So when we talk drones, we're really talking uncrewed systems across all of the roles of air power. My central contention, which will come as no surprise, you can see my article on the Wavell Room where I talk about the future is uncrewed. Drones, in the sense that I've described, could be a replacement for our crewed combat systems today. The principal limiting factors, I would argue, and will argue, are bureaucracy, lack of ambition, and the lack of the immediate pressure of war driving the kind of evolution that we only really get when we're confronted with the failure of old assumptions. The reason that I think that is, first of all, that I think future wars will be driven by dissimilar rearmament. You tell me what you estimate our attrition rates to be in a conflict with a peer or near peer adversary, but from my prior experience, they would be higher even with our most advanced aircraft. Currently takes 4 years to manufacture a Typhoon. I'm told best estimates, if they were to accelerate that, it would take 18 to 24 months. Best case from open source figures is that Europe could manufacture 15 F-35s a year. That is not fast enough to replace the equipment that we have. Therefore, we will need to replace them with something different. Right now, Russia is producing 300k drones per month, Ukraine 200k a month. China has just put in an order for 1 million. And if you scale up Russia's manufacturing base to note that China's is 14 times larger, means that feasibly, if China were to turn its attention to drones in the way that Russia has, it would be producing 4.2 million drones a month. We are going to need dissimilar rearmament against that kind of threat. Secondly is the equation of dollar cost, dollar damage. That's always driven our ability to endure in war. It's a lesson that Ukrainians have relearned. I would argue that through the late Cold War and certainly the post-Cold War period, we have privileged effectiveness over efficiency, and the consequence of that is exquisite capabilities. And the other thing that's driven that is the need for export, where very large, expensive equipment can drive higher returns for the companies that manufacture it. I'm going to use Russian kit because I think they've suffered from the same incentives, even though they're cheaper than us generally. An Su-57 costs between $35 and $54 million. A number of those have been destroyed on the ground with one-way attack drones costing not even a tenth of that. An S-400 system costs about $500 million, and a number of those systems have been destroyed by drones for which, for the same amount of money, you could purchase 625 and it only takes 1 or 2 to kill it. Reverse the equation. It costs about $2 million for an S-400 surface-to-air system to shoot down an aircraft. So there's $2 million for a drone that costs less than half of that, around 150 to 300k. In the Battle of Britain, furthermore, I would argue that the limiting factor, and many have argued the limiting factor on our ability to maintain the fight, was being able to recycle our pilots. With uncrewed systems, you remove that limitation. One of our strengths is that our pilots parachuted back to ground within our territory and were back in the air instantly. Uncrewed systems don't have that problem. Dollar cost to dollar damage in Ukraine is running at between 0.4% and 0.2%. You won't achieve that with a manned-unmanned VIX mix. I think that drones can replace crewed aircraft in the role of control of the air. Witness the Vista F-16 doing basic fighter maneuvering or dogfighting in the US. I think that even if you had exquisite systems in sufficient numbers, drones would still dominate the air between 0 to 10,000 feet, largely rendering control of the air above it irrelevant. I think they can clearly replace our systems in ISR. I think battlefield air interdiction, close air support and attack, it's very clear that drones can concentrate and disperse faster than our current crewed aircraft. Same for strategic bombing with runs on Moscow, and air mobility I've already covered. Within visual range, air-to-air combat is clearly something AI could do better immediately, given given that essentially the pilot right now is responding to a signal on an electronic scene, a radar signal, never seeing the aircraft that it's destroying. That's clearly something that could be and should be automated immediately. And then lastly, and the thing that really underpins everything I say about this, is the speed of technological change. So back in 2011, Mark Andreessen told the world that software was eating the world. It's only just starting to eat defence. That was driven by Moore's law, where semiconductor performance increases roughly 2x every 18 months. In AI, we see a 10x decrease in the cost to deploy systems every 12 months. We're seeing a 200,000% increase in over 5 years of the amount of data we can train them on, a 300,000x increase in the amount of compute, continuing at a 300% per year rate. I can go on and on. You don't have to believe in science fiction to believe that we're heading towards AGI. You just have to believe in straight lines on graphs. And all of those are delivering real world effects. We've passed multiple human benchmarks. We had one called the ARC AGI that proved that AI can reason recently. That went in December. We're now on something called humanity's last exam. So to wrap up, that direction of travel, I mean, even with narrow AI now, we could replace humans in the loop and in the cockpit. And with where AI is going, it's incontrovertible. The idea we'll have a pilot in the cockpit of an optionally crewed aircraft in 2040 is for the birds and requires ignoring all of that data that I've laid out. Lastly, Lawrence Friedman tells us that the thing that has consistently determined war is the ability of combatants to endure and continue the fight day after day, week after week, month after month. It's not sexy, but the myth of decisive victory continues to infect our planning. If you're going to do that, you're going to need uncrewed systems in a place where most of the Western world is suffering from a demographic crunch, where getting our people to fight is extremely difficult, and where the current systems that we manufacture are just too expensive. It will be speed of manufacturing and sustainability of production that determine whether we win or not, and that will need uncrewed systems. We will neither fight nor deter effectively with the balance of systems that we have or plan to have, and it needs to change.
Great. Thanks very much, Keith, for a wonderfully provocative start. I think we're going to return to those themes of bureaucracy, lack of ambition, industrial capacity, immediacy of war. But to take the conversation next, we move over to Greg Bagwell. Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks to FASI for hosting this. Always a pleasure to be part of the Freeman Aerospace Institute, and to my fellow panelists. Well, who am I in all this? Well, I guess I'm the dinosaur pilot who's going to try and make a case for keeping some people in the cockpit. But let's put a bit of balance on this. I thought there could no better place to go for my answer, and in this day, even old people like me know how to use AI. I thought I'd go to the guru, which is obviously Elon Musk, who is the man who knows all about drones and about the future of pilots, which he clearly doesn't have a very strong regard for. So I went into Grok AI and I typed in, will drones replace or supplement crewed aircraft in future air warfare? Let me read you the answer. But before I do, I think it's worth reminding everyone that the tech bros and the AI kings in America are the individuals who currently have put Donald Trump in power. So maybe we shouldn't trust everything they say. However, this is what Mr. Musk's AI machine says. Drones will likely supplement, not fully replace, crewed aircraft in future air warfare. Crewed aircraft offer unmatched situational awareness, decision-making, and adaptability in complex high-stakes missions, especially where human judgment is critical, e.g. strategic strikes, contested environments. I'll be honest with all of you, I'm not sure I agree with that analysis, but I'm going to go with Grok, carry on reading. Drones excel in persistence, cost efficiency, and expendability for tasks like reconnaissance, electronic warfare, or swarm tactics. Fair enough. By 2030, expect hybrid operations, crewed fighters, e.g. F-35s, as command nodes, coordinating drone swarms for ISR decoy roles or missile delivery. The USAF's NGAD program, or now cunningly named after our 47th president, F-47, concepts like Loyal Wingman, the XQ-58 Valkyrie, show this integration. Drones, however, lack the resilience and flexibility of pilots in dynamic dogfights or against advanced countermeasures. But their numbers and low cost, and Keith covered that very well, I thought. $3 million for a drone. I don't know where they've got that average figure, but I'll go with that. Versus 110 million for an F-35, make them ideal for attritable roles. It does, to be fair, go on and talk about some of the challenges. Cyber vulnerabilities, limited autonomy in jammed environments, ethical concerns over lethal and legal decisions mean humans stay central to the air power domain. It then goes on to talk about what X says about it. So there you go. That's what Grok AI says, and if it's Mr. Musk, it must be true. But where do I actually sit? I think we're going to replace some things. I think we're going to supplement some things, and I think there are things that drones will not be allowed to touch. So let me just quickly catch those in the last 2 minutes. I think the things that are probably now looking quite vulnerable to a drone replacement are close air support missions. Anything within 20, 30 Ks of the front line is not a good place to be for a manned system these days. Low threat surveillance, still a very good role for a drone, whether it's crewed or uncrewed. And counterinsurgency, another low air threat environment where drones have already proved incredibly valuable in those types of environments. And battlefield delivery of small loads. And I think we're about to see the Prince of Wales trial some of that on its current sailing. Where will it supplement? I think the SEAD-DEAD, suppression of enemy air defense and destruction of enemy air defense role, is definitely where we're seeing some of the high-end drones beginning to look now. Obviously, potentially replace some mass, because they'll be able to put sensors and weapon systems in the air that manned aircraft will just need extras for. It'll look at doing decoys and that forward sensor role. The roles I think it's going to struggle to do are things like CASEVAC. You're going to need a medic close to the individual. So the idea of just scraping someone off the battlefield and droning them back, they'll be dead before they get there. Policing and peacekeeping is another role where you need to eyeball what's going on, and you need to warn people. And doing that with a machine is so much more difficult than doing it with a human. So I think policing and peacekeeping type functions, i.e. below the threshold of full-on war, is where that human is going to be so critical. And that's where the moral and ethical conversation comes in. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions there. That's my 5 minutes. I think, therefore, we're in between. It's going to be a bit of both, and it will develop over time. I think the area that's probably the least proven right now is the loyal drone, the more advanced capabilities. But also, I think we also need to be wary of just observing everything through a lens of Ukraine. That is a very unique, well, I say unique, it's a bit more like 1914, but a very attritional land campaign that is not the way that NATO would choose to fight if it could. That's my point, Sam.
Thanks, Greg. And keeping on the theme of AI-generated solutions to today's policy-making problems, Keith has a really interesting article looking at AI-generated SDR, which I would encourage you all to read. But looking ahead to Dominika now, of course, she has her paper out tomorrow. But Dominika, we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts on this.
Thanks so much, Aaron, and for your kind introduction, and of course, Freeman Air and Space Institute for hosting this webinar. I will agree and disagree with my fellow panelists, and because to me as well, this question as it stands, it's not a yes or no answer, because to me, drones, it's first and foremost an uncrewed delivery vehicle that comes in many shapes and sizes. And so I would look at this from a more functional perspective, that we have drones for various tasks, as my previous speakers outlined, that drones for data collection, for delivering explosives in logistics. So in terms of whether it's a replacement or supplement, I believe the logic of dull, dirty, and dangerous still applies. However, I would refrain from thinking that one technology can solve all our problems. So to answer this question, I would rather outline like what are the actual two main challenges to me, thinking about crewed, uncrewed vehicles. First of all, it's not to overestimate the impact of new drone technologies, because as we see like over the course of the 2-3 decades, how the character of the drone warfare has changed. That Previously, there was international counterterrorism operations with air superiority and a large drone platforms conducting this type of missions. Whereas in current drone warfare in the war in Ukraine, it's more about small drones becoming even ammunition themselves and basically fulfilling the role of attrition. So my point here is that it's important to keep in mind the political and strategic context for thinking about these mission objectives for the drones to fulfill, and not the other way around. The second point I would like to raise is the more structural change that we need to pay attention to, meaning the increasing importance of private sector and commercial technology, driving the cost of these means down, and at the same time increasing the importance of the software. This, of course, comes with mainly in industrial and ethical challenges, let's say. So it's then important to strike the balance not only between whether we're going to continue this crewed aircraft for this type of missions, or rather replace it with a remotely operated system, or even with an even greater level of autonomy. But it's also about how we're going to prioritize mass for attrition versus mass for precision. So how the sophistication of the uncrewed platform gonna be, because for instance, whether we're gonna prioritize lower cost or increase the self-defenses of a drone platform. So I would like to just open this bigger picture question when we are thinking about incorporating new technologies into armed forces. And I believe this is very well reflected in the new UK defense drone strategy. But I believe we need to think more about challenges in terms of acquisition and working with new suppliers once the mission objectives are well defined. So I believe, yes, the software heavy procurement is a completely new challenge on the horizon. So yeah, I will be looking forward to the discussion. I will leave it there. So thank you, Aaron, and back to you.
Great. Thanks to all of the contributions so far. We've got some great questions that are coming through. Keep them coming, please, through the Q&A function, and I'll feed them through to the panelists in due course. I think Dominika ended there on quite an interesting note, the sort of self-defenses angle of things, but also the extent to which there is this sort of innovation, counter-innovation cycle that's taking place. It's interesting that we haven't quite touched on counter-UAS so far. We've been naturally very focused on the extent to which drones can replace or supplement. But I wondered if perhaps starting off with Dominika here, where does sort of counter-UAS fit into this? Is it just a case of us continually investing in drones and hoping that we can have that technical advantage, or is that just going to be negated by Dragonfire and everything else that's going on in the counter-UAS space at the moment?
Thanks for highlighting this issue, because that goes back to what Keith was talking about, and that's the question of cost and the cost per ratio effect, and the fact that the defending against drones is on the losing side, let's say, in terms of how like how expensive it is to neutral. Deny the drone operation. So in one sense, I don't believe that there should be like putting all eggs in one basket, but really looking also on the countering drone strategy side, because I from what I see, like there's lot of different ways how to stop the drone, but it's still on the catching up side. That the countering drone technology is really about how to figure out to make it in a sustainable manner, because shooting $1 million worth missile against a drone that costs a few $100, it's not sustainable, clearly. So in that sense, it will be. And then if I may add, I don't like if you follow the situation with countering the Houthi rebels, they keep downing very expensive combat drones that are costing millions of dollars. So it's again the question of the appropriateness of the technology for the mission in this sense. So I maybe other panels have something to add, but I would say layered defenses is the real answer to this question, like thinking creatively and having backup plans.
Yeah, the Houthi situation is really interesting because I think anywhere from 5 to 10% of the US Reaper force has been shot down over Yemen, which obviously, when you think about the cost per Reaper, that's a big price that the Americans are paying. Granted that we're dealing there with systems that were designed for a very different counterinsurgency environment than today, but even so, it's very similar types of adversaries that the US is fighting against. I mean, Greg, you sort of mentioned that drones in the area of at least counterinsurgency and the sort of low threat environments, you still see them as having a lot of utility. I mean, what do you make of that Houthi situation?
Yeah, well, the difference is with the Houthis, of course, is they still have an air defense capability that we haven't been able to neuter. So, even with relatively basic, older Soviet SAMs, a Reaper is a sitting duck. It's the same reason we saw the TB2 disappear from the battlefield at the beginning of the Russian invasion. Once the defense systems got into place, the slow, relatively static drones that really had no self-defense capability whatsoever were suddenly vulnerable. And if they're expensive, then you can't afford to lose them. So you've got to shift to the cheaper models. So it's become an economic war, as everybody has already said. So all those facts become true. I think it's what's fascinating for the Americans, of course, over Yemen is why haven't they developed a cheaper surveillance drone in order to not keep losing Reapers whilst doing that particular mission? Unless, of course, you never can tell with the military. Sometimes in America, they like to get rid of things so they can buy some new ones. So, you're always a bit suspicious when they start losing a few. But I think what's been fascinating in Ukraine is watching the development of drones is a little bit like going back in time and watching the development of air power in 1914. And it's been quite slow. And the counters we're using are literally, netting, shotguns being carried by small drones. I mean, it is pretty rudimentary stuff. So somewhere that's going to start escalating. We're going to start seeing more sophisticated capabilities on both sides, both the counters and within the drones, which of course will see costs come up. And then the equation is going to be different again as we start to move into a different price range. So yeah, it's still got some way to go, but at the moment, I sense that it's only the fact that people are innovating so quickly is that they're able to keep up with the counters. But actually, the counters aren't doing a bad job now of beginning to weigh heavy. It's why they've now gone to fiber optics as a good example.
Keith, if you're sort of dealing with an adversary that's fielding 5 million drones, how many countermeasures are we going to be able to, or how many countermeasures are we going to need to be able to defeat something of that scale?
Well, I think important to say that figure is an extrapolation based on China's industrial base scales relative to Russia, relative monthly production. So it's 4.2 million a month. And so that 6-week time frame that we see in Ukraine of constant innovation is happening, but with 4.2 million drones being updated every month that come at you. I think we need to distinguish between what we're talking about here. So on the one hand, we have Azargat's Red Queen race in warfare, right? From Lewis Carroll, where the two Red Queens race around and around, and the faster they run, both have to run faster and faster just to keep up because both sides are accelerating. And in Azargat's example, that's attack and defense. Like that's never going to change. That's warfare since the beginning of warfare. It in no way has any bearing, in my view, on whether the future in the next 3 to 5 years is uncrewed or not. It just tells you that there are countermeasures, and then there are countermeasures, and then there are countermeasures, and whether there's a pilot in the cockpit or not, to me, is utterly irrelevant to that question. I think the broader counter to, well, we won't be fully uncrewed because, and some of the arguments I hear are, well, because we could just use electronic warfare, and one way or the other you'd be able to burn all these things out the sky. And you're like, well, no, you can put shielding on aircraft. There's no reason why that would be true. And then people say, well, what about you need a data link? Well, you don't have to have a data link any more than you have to have radio comms to the piloted aircraft. You could have computer vision based systems that can do everything that the pilot can do. So that I don't see like the counters, and we can go through those one by one, but I won't bore the audience by attempting to do that now. But essentially, I think that argument doesn't hold. To the question of how we respond to it, I mean, yeah, I think again the danger of conflating here drones between things that are kind of glorified quadcopters or a bit bigger that can be easily shot down by the Dragonfire and the lasers at relatively short range, with drones that might be, and I'll use Japan's example again of the FX fighter that can essentially do everything that a Typhoon or an F-35 could do at the same sort of ranges, at the same sort of altitudes, just without a pilot in the cockpit, because of the speed of advancing tech and because of what we can already do today. How do you counter? Well, I do think that does change some tactical elements for warfare, and we see that in US doctrine, I think increasingly in the UK, but I know for a fact in USAF doctrine, where dispersal is going to be much more important. Movement is going to be much more important. If you can produce 4.2 million drones of all sizes a month, then the threat you face is not just quantitatively but qualitatively different. You're going to have to fight differently, and I think that will be radically different. And I think what that means from a tech and a tactics perspective is much more AI at the edge, which doesn't need to go back to a big data center, isn't operating in the cloud, and is performing at similar levels today. And I remind you of that huge increase, 10x every 12 months as opposed to 2x every 18 months of AI improvement versus Moore's law. And that's not the most ambitious measure either of AI progress. It's just a solid middle ground, which is still breathtaking.
Just staying with you, Keith, the Shadow Defense Secretary wrote a piece on Conservative Home yesterday, looking at drones, the importance of drones, how the UK can boost drone production. And one of his arguments was actually using the primes to scale up drones production as just one option. Actually, what he would definitely push for is partnering up UK-based drone startups with what's going on in Ukraine, essentially lengthening the production line, protecting that production line from bombings in Ukraine. I mean, there's a big question in all of this, and if we go down the route of much more uncrewed and crewed aircraft take a bit of a backseat, what happens to traditional aerospace industries? I mean, is that something that we have to sacrifice, or do we have some way of getting them around, going down the drone route instead of the sort of typical exquisite systems instead?
I'm going to make myself very unpopular with a lot of good friends when I answer this question. So look, I think SMEs have an absolutely crucial role in driving innovation forward at the pace that we need it. They can just operate a lot quicker. They're not stuck in old sclerotic bureaucracies. Their incentives are all to challenge and test and push the boundaries. It's rare that an SME can scale in its own number of people or its manufacturing sufficient to deliver the kind of numbers like 4.2 million a month in China. That's like not me and my mates. I mean, literally in my case, operating out of a shed. I don't build drones, but as an example of an SME and how they tend to operate. So I think it will have to be with the primes, not against them. I think in a truly conventional war scenario, we would see multiple elements of our industry repurposed. Witness the UK's, the way we repurposed our motor manufacturing industry in the Second World War. Like, it's that kind of thing. But it's with the primes. I think the only way that happens is if we have something like Senator Warner imposed on the US military in 2010 through congressional legislation, which was a mandated target that 33% of all systems in the US military, land, naval, and air had 33% had to be fully uncrewed by 2015. I was on exchange with the USAF for some of that period, and I can tell you, they fought that tooth and nail. They absolutely hated it. And after 2013, they killed it. But the only reason we have all of those uncrewed systems, and indeed many of the uncrewed companies that we have in the US that lead the world, is because they were mandated and forced to adopt these things. Like we shouldn't underestimate how deep the institutional inertia and opposition to uncrewed systems is. It only happens with a mandated target. And that's why we have those systems optimized for the wars we fought in 2008 and 13, being shot down in the wars of 2025. Like, we don't have them now because we don't have that target forcing people to innovate at the pace we need to. So to answer your question in order, like primes are absolutely essential. Industry has a role. SMEs are crucial. But you probably don't get to the scale you need without the involvement of primes, and in a true conventional war, without like the repurposing of large chunks of our existing industry, none of which I think we're currently preparing for or moving towards.
Great. And we're delighted to have so many questions through. So I'll just, if you'll indulge me, one more question. I think Greg wants to jump in there before I do that.
I think what Keith highlights here is the whole economics of drone manufacturing is they don't follow the manned aircraft model, not even close, and therefore thinking about it in that way is dangerous. And if you can make 4.5 million in a month, then we don't need to make any now. We'll make them a month when we get a month's warning of a conflict, because then we'll build the one that's relevant to that time, as opposed to building them now and putting them in a big box for 4 years whilst they slowly but surely go out of date and out of time. And if you can't build them now, then how do you create a manufacturing production line that can spin up to that point? Because where primes make money on manned platforms is we operate them 24/7, 365 days a year. And it's the money that's spent on operating those platforms in training and exercises and deterrence posture is what generates an economic model that sustains the primes, that sustains the SMEs. If we're all just sat here with a design on the table ready to press print when the war turns up, that's a really difficult economic model and a sustainable economic manufacturing structure to create. So we can talk about these big numbers, but the money doesn't add up. Now, if you're going to find a benefactor prepared to stick a shed load of money for something that might go out of date in 6 months that you're not going to use for 5 years, we've got a problem. So drones, it's an attractive proposition and the numbers are compelling, but the business case is rubbish.
Wonderfully uplifting note. The economics, of course, you mentioned there, Greg, really, really important. The cultural element, which you started your remarks with, equally so. I note that the USAF Chief of Staff, I think last month, made this big announcement that the collaborative combat aircraft that are currently in development there, the prototypes there, have received fighter designation. So this is the first time that uncrewed aircraft in the US Air Force inventory have received fighter designations. Do you sort of welcome that announcement? Is that the fact that they're beginning to think about uncrewed systems seriously, or is it bad in that they are trying to equate unmanned system or the current traditional systems with uncrewed systems?
I think, again, Keith makes a good point that unless you drive people to make change, that there are systems, and militaries are particularly bad, is that change doesn't happen. I think we have moved into a different headspace with drones. I think that there's clearly an acceptance that they have a place. We all operate them in different ways. And now the question is, okay, what else can they do and what can we replace? And quite frankly, if the economics and the capability stacks up, then that's the argument that wins here. We don't need a theoretical argument about what should be the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. The facts will speak for themselves. The war games will demonstrate what works, and you will buy a war-winning capability for the budget that you can afford. Giving them numbers and names to try and pretend they're something they're not is fine. I mean, I'm not sure it changes many people's views, and sometimes it does more harm than good, if I'm honest, because we've had a few false dawns here. And even now we're now talking about F-47 and Tempest as being absolutely 100% crewed. Now, is that because the pilots made a stronger argument and lobbied harder? I don't know. Or is it genuinely because the alternative doesn't really match up yet?
Well, you mentioned false dawns. We have a question here from Sir Chris Coville, who's a visiting professor with us at FASI. And he sort of questions this idea of, haven't we all been here before? Citing here Duncan Sand's 1957 defense review. I mean, Keith, returning to you here, thinking about innovation and innovation cycles. I mean, are we just getting hyped up over nothing?
No. Is the short answer. No, I mean it's very clear what these capabilities can do now. Like the thesis that I lay out, I think is pretty clear in its premises on the current rate of advance. The number of times people have been wrong in forecasting that AI would never in the past, like consistently. Every time we define a benchmark, then we exceed it. We've never had an uncrewed program that's devoted the kind of funds to developing an uncrewed system that we've devoted to manned fighter aircraft. If we did, my contention would be we could develop such a system now. In fact, quite the opposite. One SME did bid in the past for a UK program, was told to dial back the capabilities they said they could do. They had to, no, you have to be within specification. Now, some of that is like boring technical procurement stuff, and some of that absolutely isn't that, and is cultural resistance to just how capable these systems could be. I think on the economics of it, these systems could do today, can do today, everything that a crewed system could do. We just don't have any programs on anything like the scale that we would need in order to prove that contention. And if they could, then they would be operating. And yeah, it's true that like each generation of drones goes out of date very, very rapidly. But that's the true. I mean, my dissimilar rearmament point at the start is that warfare has already overtaken the capabilities that we have now. It's just that we only are going to find that out the hard way when the war starts and attrition rates mean that we can't afford to wait 18 months at best case for another Typhoon or a 15 F-35s rolling off European production lines every 12, well, what was it? Yeah, every 12 months, 15 every 12 months off European production lines is nothing like enough. And all of that ignores the fact that we also have a huge demographic crunch, that it takes time to train pilots that we wouldn't likely be operating over Britain and able to recycle them the way we did in the Battle of Britain. So for me, like the economics stacks up, the evidence stacks up for where we are and where we're going, and it is primarily cultural resistance. And the only reason we have the systems that we do today is because Senator Warner overcame that by saying it must be 33%. And the USAF did what it, and the USAF, US Navy and US Army did what it had to do only because it was mandated to do it. And the minute they were able to stop, they stopped. So like for me, the evidence is pretty clear both on where we are and why we're there.
Thanks. I know there's been a couple of questions raised about the morals and the moral dilemmas of using uncrewed systems. And of course, this has been well studied in the literature. But I think what's different today, at least, is the fact that you're not sort of sitting in this cubicle someplace else navigating these drones in faraway places. But actually, if you consider places like Ukraine, you have people literally on the front line navigating these particularly small FPV drones. Dominika, just thinking about your research and your work, do you see any different moral challenges that are faced by the use of operators of smaller drones as opposed to the more traditional drones that Western militaries have grown accustomed to over the past few decades?
Yeah, right now, interesting discussion going on. Well, but to a question, well, as I put it in my other article, in Ukraine, the drones have boots, in a sense that the drone operators are part of the warfighting. So the remote warfare is not that remote. So that's first thing. So meaning that the way how the impact of operating drones is very immediate, and it's like really on like the individual level. Like it's not just that the soldier operating this the first person view drone can see over the hill and then strike the target, but the fact that he needs to trust, for instance, his fellow warfighters to protect him while he's doing that. So that's one of the things I'm concerned in terms of how the adaptation of armed forces is going, whether this is taking into account the new task for soldiers while using drones on the ground. And that's clearly different from the previous drone wars, because when we were talking about the ethical and legal challenges and in the drone operations, where as you mentioned, the pilot was somewhere thousands of kilometers away from the actual drone operation, that the legal challenges were more pronounced in a way that some were suggesting that it's more about assassinations and not actual following the rules of war. So those actually the remoteness of drone warfare is actually on a spectrum in this sense. So that's one thing. But if I may, I was also thinking, based on like hearing what you were talking about, that in this adoption challenge of new, constantly evolving drone technology, we should not forget about the role of the human and maintaining the tech literacy of the airmen still present in air forces, and how their task will be evolving, and that they need to understand that if it's really about superior software, that they know what's going on and they can understand and maintain certain meaningful control over the drone operation, even though their actual active role is diminished. So, but I believe we're gonna talk about it. So thank you for the question.
It sort of leads us on to a group of questions that I want to collate together on GCAP and sort of next generation fighters. So this is a combination of Jeffrey Wardle, Sophie Anthropos, and Junpei Ishimaru, who basically question the economics and the cost effectiveness of producing a uncrewed equivalent of the F-35 or GCAP, and what sort of complications, unexpected complications there might be. I just wanted to open that up really to the panel, just considering we've spoken just now about the lower end of the drone spectrum, as it were, as we go up those various ACP tiers, thinking about straightforward replacement of next generation crewed systems, which I think Keith was beginning to talk about in his remarks, with uncrewed. Is that feasible, or is that a bit of a chimera? Potentially start with you, Keith, and then others can chip in.
Well, I think how should we consider that? I think you'd start with, well, what is the speed of tech progress? How far have we advanced in AI and automation in the last 5, 10, 15 years? Is that rate speeding up? And then you look at that and project it forward, and you say, okay, well, how far away is 2040? And therefore, what proportionally might we reasonably expect? What are the reasons to think that progress might cease? And therefore, is it reasonable to deduce that we're going to have a pilot in the aircraft in 2040? So from a tech and efficiency and an effective point, I've made that case over and over again. No, there won't be a pilot in the cockpit of that aircraft. I have heard this export argument over and over again. In fact, we had the argument when I was in number 10. I don't think it stacks up. So one of the arguments is well, you can't sell an aircraft. When you sell an aircraft to a foreign air force, one of the limitations on its effectiveness, if it were to attack you, is that often their pilots are not as well trained and they're not as good. And in the US case, and there's been a lot of stuff around this lately, sometimes you get a slightly less good version of the aircraft as well, right? The problem is, if you say, well, we couldn't possibly sell an uncrewed system because we'd remove this limitation, it'd be a bit too good, so we can't possibly sell it to you. Well, there will be, the economics of the situation mean there will be another nation that is willing to sell that much more effective uncrewed system, which you don't have to rely on your pilot training system to support, and which reduces your overall costs. And so it's like saying, we're going to make this slightly less good product because otherwise we can't sell it overseas. Well, if you make that slightly less good product, no one overseas is going to want it anyway. So I think that argument, the logic of that argument, is never clearly laid out to me, other than this: well, we couldn't possibly sell a fully effective uncrewed system overseas because it would perform at its maximum potential. I don't think that works. I'll leave it there. I think that's enough.
Greg, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, just trying to follow from that point. I mean, so if you look at GCAP, why did we, the UK, choose to pursue a manned sixth generation fighter as the future of our defence aerospace? Because actually, you could argue there was a gap in the market for a fifth, sixth generation drone, but we haven't chosen to go down that route in the UK. Europe looks like they're having a go at it. We are looking at the big hitters in the States as the only ones that have really got the scale or the money to be able to try and look at that. So we are slightly in danger of being behind the drag curve anyway in terms of competing, because the companies that are going to be selling those types of drones are largely going to be American at this rate. I mean, that's just the truth of it. Now, whether we can undercut them or find a route to a more innovative solution, I don't know. We'll have to see. But coming back to the need or cost of a pilot, I mean, I think there was an argument a few years ago that said the pilot was the expensive bit. I'm not sure that runs anymore. I mean, an ejection seat probably costs you the best part of £1 million. An oxygen system and the interface is maybe another million. So you're talking less than 2% of the overall cost of the platform. So the only real cost is the cost of the training. Okay, fine, you need to think that through too. But I always go back to my much more basic argument. If this was so simple, why have we still got ships sailing through the Red Sea with people on them? Why have we still got trucks driving around the UK with people in it? Why have we still got potholes that can't mend themselves? I mean, if we're so clever and all this is so simple, why aren't we doing the simple things? But apparently the really, really difficult thing, the 3D supersonic chess, with all the moral and ethical issues with killing people, is the problem we should solve first. I mean, I that's the bit that just staggers me. If this all stacks up, why haven't the economics proven that taking the person out and that cost or that risk it can be demonstrated anywhere else? Now, there are some areas where you can demonstrate it and you see it happening. Normally in autocratic regimes that can impose driverless cars like China, but we struggle with that concept over here, and you see how Tesla's struggling with it. I mean, Elon Musk has had to fire all the inspector generals to get all the claims off his back. So, why can't we do the simple stuff is the question I'd have for Keith.
I think that was directed to you, Keith.
I thought I should be invited to reply rather than just jump in. Well, we do have driverless cars, so we could have had this argument at any point. We have driverless taxis in Shanghai, Singapore, and San Francisco. You could get in one tomorrow. They have much lower accident rates than the taxis that are driven by humans. Why don't we have them more broadly? Well, because the dread risks, like we know. I assume nobody will contest this. I won't lay out all the evidence for it, but we know that if we rolled out uncrewed driverless cars across the UK tomorrow, we would have fewer accidents and fewer deaths. But the ones that we did have would be much more controversial if you're killed by the undriven by the car without a human in it, not for rational reasons, but because people don't like the idea of it. Well, in war, like, fairness is sort of irrelevant, and I don't think that should be a barrier. Why do I push aircraft? And I do push aircraft more strongly than maritime and ground systems. Well, one, because it's my service and I want to see us perform at the cutting edge, as I know we all do. But that's my good faith answer is I want to see the Air Force be at the cutting edge. I think it should be. I think it should be the early adopter of technology. Two, because we know that the things that machines find hard are the things that we find easy. So the three hardest things for AI to do are proprioception, your sense of yourself in time and space, dexterity and locomotion, and with the exception of proprioception, those things are absolutely irrelevant in air warfare. They're not irrelevant for ground warfare, and it's a major barrier. Like trying to get a vehicle to go through the complex ground clutter is much harder. Air-to-air combat is airborne maths, and therefore should be the most amenable to these systems. Why haven't we seen it to date? Well, it's really difficult sitting here knowing the answer and biting your tongue, but the reason we have an uncrewed, an optionally crewed system, I would suggest is largely the result of politics and not rational deduction from the evidence. It's really difficult, but that is my strongly held opinion. And like this idea that we can't possibly keep up with the US, we're spending and there are estimates that are a lot higher than this, but estimated 12 billion on GCAP. A 12 billion injection to say we're going uncrewed first could see us lead the world in this space at a time where having sovereign capability has never been more important. I would love to see that go in, and I think we would lead the world in it, and we genuinely could. But we won't. And it's not because the evidence doesn't stack up. It's not because the evidence isn't there. It's because the only way you cut through this kind of bureaucratic inertia and conservatism, frankly, which the Air Force should not have. We were set up to be an antidote to that kind of conservatism in technology. Is the thing that holds us back. So you need some kind of external target, hence the 33% from Senator Warner, why we have uncrewed systems that we do today.
I want to shift the conversation a little bit I think, well, Dominica, you have something?
Curious what Greg has to say into his own question, but if I may, I like from like a more like a broader perspective, like it's not giving the technology too much agency, you know. It's like clearly like technology changes at a much faster pace than the human change or like the culture. So and answering the question like why we don't have uncrewed for fleets and squadrons, it's because I believe like a human they are afraid of losing control of the situation and don't trust the technology enough. That will be my big picture question, probably answer. So I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Well, I think it resonates with a question from Matthew Saville from RUSI, which basically we've spoken a lot about economics and the economic imperatives behind going uncrewed, but maybe there are some moral or ethical considerations that might preclude that straightforward economic cost advantage. Any brief comments on that?
Well, I was struck by Keith's point that, you know, the reason traffic accidents with uncrewed vehicles is contentious because of that moral, ethical dilemma. But in warfare, it wouldn't matter. I would argue we're under far more scrutiny in warfare. I felt far more free in my car than I ever did in my fighter aircraft. In terms of the level of scrutiny, everything's recorded, everything's tracked, everything's based on legal advice. The idea that warfare allows you more latitude, I think, is an interesting moral discussion. It clearly does with some people, notably Russia and China, in which case we need to think very hard about how we fight an enemy that is not going to worry about those things. But I think the idea that we in the West are going to find warfare somewhere where we can be more loose, shall we say, with our oversight, I think we're going to struggle with that. And that may be our Achilles heel, who knows?
Can I come in on both
Sure,
questions on that? So my point is that warfare is fundamentally different. Warfare lets you kill people, whereas driving on the roads, you're not allowed to. And at the point that I'm going to be killed by whatever it is, I don't really care what it was launched from. Like I'm pink mist at the end of it. And so like the fairness element, I don't think is relevant there, but it has been relevant throughout history in ways that really, really matter. Like when we first developed catapults, the Greeks said this was the end of morals in war because it meant we could attack from range and kill people, and you didn't have to, you know, stab someone from 3 feet with a sword. When we developed archers and archery, we had the same debates over why those things were immoral. Then we have the same thing with machine guns. Then, as we all know, with air power, we had this idea that it was just fundamentally immoral to bomb from the air in that way, and that it would the morality of we talk about the morality of altitude, how it was making it too easy to kill people, and so we had to constrain these things. There were genuinely attempts to ban aircraft as weapons of war for that reason. The idea in Kosovo that it led to a Jupiter complex where we could kind of throw thunderbolts from the sky at those that had upset us. Like this is not a new thing. Brian Burridge, when drones came out, said it was the end of virtue in war or something like that, or that drone warfare would be virtueless war. Well, that like maybe that's true. Maybe it is true that I have to take a lot less risk now to kill the person on the other side. But that's not a moral question. That's a fairness question, and it wasn't relevant when we invented catapults and archery, and it isn't relevant with drones either. I think you can see that as well. Like what is different when it comes to targeting? So targeting requires that the target is distinct, that it's necessary, that it's proportionate, that it's proportionate and that it's humane. And then the UK adds that it's lawful according to our laws. Well, all of those things can be just as when I delegate authority. I mean, I wouldn't have done this. Greg would have done this. When you delegate the authority to lethal force to a subordinate commander, you have to trust that that person has been trained sufficiently. They're going to perform within certain parameters, and so on and so forth. You have to have the trust in the individual. So too, you have to have the trust in the system. But then you're accountable for having delegated the authority. I just don't see there is any fundamental difference. And my point is that is not that the difference in war is that you're allowed to kill people. the fundamental difference, and that in the end, whether that's done by an uncrewed system or a crewed system doesn't matter as long as it complies with those laws of war that I laid out at the end.
Just staying with you, Keith, and then I want to turn over to Dominica to ask some questions about software. But there are two questions more or less directed to you. The first from Martin Bindman asking about the role of uncrewed systems in QRA and whether you think society would accept uncrewed systems undertaking QRA missions to protect obviously sites in London akin to 9/11. So do we have the trust in those systems? And then secondly, from Sarah Slimp, thinking about, okay, if this is acceptable, if we ought to embrace uncrewed systems more in warfare, but in other settings as well, peacekeeping, etc., how do we ensure proper oversight and accountability and control?
So the first question, I'll give an easy answer and then a harder one. So we already have those kind of air defense systems. I've had them since the Falklands. I think Sea Dart and Sea Wolf, if memory serves. So there'll be somebody on the call that can correct me quickly if I haven't got that quite right. But the idea of automated air defense systems is not new. I don't see that it makes much difference if it's at range, but I think that's maybe not a fully good faith response to the question. Where I think what people are talking about is like, would we accept having to shoot down, for example, a civilian airliner like on 9/11 using an uncrewed system? I think it would be enormously controversial if we did it with a human in the aircraft. We did have this debate over and around what was then FCAS during my last appointment in government. I just, without going through it line by line, I just don't think the argument stacks up that there's any fundamental difference in the end to who pulls the trigger. There's a question of like, well, how much data do you send back? Who gets to make the decision? Whether there's physically a pilot in the cockpit at the time that it's made is another matter. I just don't think it's relevant. So I don't see a situation. I mean, you could, but I don't see a situation where if it's over UK territory, it's unlikely that there would be the kind of comms jamming that means it has to be fully autonomous. In the same way that if a pilot is in a Typhoon doing the intercept on a civilian airliner, they're unlikely to be delegated the authority to just press the button. They're almost certainly going to have to crudely put radio back to get permission to do it. So true, the uncrewed system would be likely sending back a live full motion video feed. It would be sending back all the data it has, and somebody on the ground, most likely the Prime Minister, would be making the decision that says shoot it down. And at that point, the person who's accountable when the pilot presses the button was the Prime Minister, and the person that was responsible when the aircraft releases it automatically from the uncrewed system would be the Prime Minister. So I don't think it's any different. And yes, I think people would accept it if it was much more well, yes, they would accept it full stop, because I don't think it's any different. How do we effectively govern these systems? I honestly think the laws of war as we currently have are more than adequate to govern the deployment of uncrewed systems. Until somebody can tell me what is fundamentally different about the deployment of uncrewed systems and the way in which they use force, I don't see a difference. And I think we govern them under the existing rules, where if I decide to delegate authority to a subordinate commander, I have to have full confidence they'll operate within certain parameters. They've had the right training. There's nothing in their past that means they're going to suddenly go rogue. And that if they do, then there's an inquest that says, well, could Keith possibly have known that in advance before he delegated authority? That would happen today with a human subformation, a pilot, whatever you want to call it. That's what should happen tomorrow with the uncrewed system. Like, did I do all the things I should have done before I delegated to use lethal force? If I didn't, then I should be prosecuted. That's the same today with crewed systems. It should be the same tomorrow with uncrewed systems.
So putting aside the ethical and moral considerations, important though they are, just want to shift gear a little bit to thinking about production, which we touched on a little bit earlier, but there's been a few questions since then concerning how do we generate combat mass and uncrewed combat mass in particular. That comes in two flavors, really. There's the software part of that discussion, and then there's the hardware part. And Dominica, you've spoken a lot about balancing those two things, right? You've got the hardware system, but it's as important that you have these spiral developments of software. What are the challenges that Western militaries are going to face when they're trying to keep up with the software, particularly if you're operating in an electronically jammed environment or there's GPS degradation? How do you keep on top of the software?
Clearly, important questions. So, like, yeah, I outlined it as a kind of sort of a dilemma between the hardware quantity and software quality. But it's also mostly Keith was talking about how the AI is increasing the importance of ones and zeros. So, in terms of challenges, what is then what does this mean for generating mass and staying on the top of the game in terms of military capabilities? That's first and foremost. It's about the speed of procurement and keeping, like, maintaining at the speed of relevance, because with the software updates, like, that's taking lessons from Ukraine. It's in questions of weeks, not months or years. So that's one thing. So having like very modular systems and making sure to to have updatable platforms in this sense. But clearly it increases the importance of the enabling operational domain of cyber. So keeping this system, the drones, secured and safe, because relying on important software creates the vulnerability, as you mentioned, for the jamming, that disabling the sensors and blinding the drone, and that all this sorts of thing. So that's on the vulnerability side once it's deployed. But back to the procurement and everything, as I mentioned, that most of this innovation is happening in the private sector, commercial sphere. So new partners, new suppliers, creating vetted network of these suppliers, new actors. It's important to make sure that the technology that the military is adopting is safe from foreign interference, for instance. That's one thing. And then what I would also caution is about creating this idea that drones with a superior software and increasing levels of autonomy are even like reinforcing this image of a drone as an agent of precision warfare, and this image of clean war, or introducing science into warfare, which as a secondary effect could lead to more like a reckless or less vigilant use of force, in that sense, and over reliance on the output from the software, and basing decisions of whatever the software is gonna create in terms of situational awareness of the drone operator. So in this sense, let's say I'm gonna use the buzzword that everyone is betting on as the staying on the top of the development in terms of AI enabled capabilities. So underlying the importance of data, and this in this sense, not only data for training, but then also making sure that the operator actually knows how the system is arriving to these conclusions, and actually not having just 3 seconds to make a yes or no decision, but really the importance of the software and the user interface, that there is no misunderstanding, and the delegation of authority, as Keith was describing, would not lead to some, I don't know, unnecessary casualties or unnecessary missteps. So in this sense, I would conclude my answer by saying that it's important to bring the end user really early in the development of these software-based capabilities. So so it's as someone else mentioned in this discussion, that the private suppliers most of the time don't have military operational experience, so they can very well visualize what the warfighter actually needs from this software, in this sense, so that the knowledge sharing is there.
Greg, you look like you want to chime in.
Yeah, I can sort of pull the two threads together here a little bit, and I'll tell a little bit of a story, which I think I can get away with. Well, until somebody tells me I can't. I mean, somebody picked up on the QRA question, which is, let's be honest, is quite a unique role, but I think it's a good one for highlighting the dilemma that we find ourselves in. a lot of people might not realize this, that QRA doesn't get airborne with an authority to shoot an airplane down. That is almost never the case. It has to go up and find out what's going on first, and then report back, and then seek permissions, etc. And normally there's an escalatory mode of conversation that gets you to the final point of engaging. That requires you to look into the cockpit and see what's going on. You literally get that close. So you are trying to see whether there's someone in the cockpit with a gun, whether there's a scuffle going on, whether there are more people in the cockpit. So, okay, you can do that with a camera, fine. But can you interpret what's going on as something unusual or something that's normal? So that then you start to build a pattern of whether that aircraft has been hijacked or not, as an example. You would then report that back. If you made that system an autonomous system that merely recorded it and sent that back somewhere else, if I tell you that there are only 3 people involved in a shoot down of a QRA aircraft, the pilot, the controller sat at High Wycombe, and probably, as Keith rightly says, the Prime Minister. And I can tell you now that we exercise regularly, and normally with the real people. So the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Defence will do a number of rehearsals where we just simulate a scenario. And if I tell you that on their first few scenarios, they always engage too late, almost always engage too late. And it requires the pilot and the controller to basically urge them that, do you not realize you've got 30 seconds left to act here? You need to make a decision. And it puts pressure on them. And more often than not, they struggle to make that call because they're not there. They're trying to gain a picture, and they start asking more questions. Can you see more people in the cockpit? Can you do this? Can you do that? And they're constantly seeking more data. And the data doesn't exist. You've just now got to make a call, a judgment call, as to whether you let that hijacked airliner crash into the centre of London, or you shoot it down somewhere over Slough. And that's an awful decision for someone to make. But ultimately, it is a human making that decision. If you made that an autonomous system, the person who's going to be making all of that call is the Prime Minister. They will have their finger on the trigger. And it's that's the moral dilemma that really highlights the worst case, and very niche, I fully accept, of that dilemma that we have seen in practice not work. When we trial it and when we try to train them, they struggle to do it. And so you're going to introduce a whole new challenge if you make them even closer to the point of the trigger, which this would.
Thanks for that. Just keeping with you, Greg, there was a question here about, obviously we focused on the hardware side, we focused on the software side, but there's a whole wider enterprise that supports. So thinking, I guess, with your ASPA hat on, how do we make sure that we are, as a nation, but as a military, as an alliance, bringing people along the journey, making sure that all of the basing infrastructure is there, all the technical skills are there, whether that's AI or in terms of actual hardware manufacturing? How do we bring industry along?
Yeah, I mean, if I had the answer to this, I'd be a very rich man. So I don't have the perfect answer. But let me tell you a few stories. So I do work for a couple of defense aerospace companies. So I do get to live this in real life as well. But what I've been even more fascinated about is I get involved quite a lot now with sponsorship into universities, with engineering students, as it happens. And I have been really impressed. In fact, I've been amazed at the level of sophistication in our universities, where you see really quite impressive research and development facilities. There is funding going in. Sometimes you walk into an empty hall and nothing's happening, but very occasionally that gets filled up suddenly with a whole bunch of SMEs or even primes doing stuff, bringing in the university. I've been to the catapult systems, all the various elements around the UK that are all involved in growing that grassroots, but also providing, if you like, an almost invisible manufacturing capability, albeit at the research and development end of the food chain. I'm just surprised, because I ask the question wherever I go, how little we've done to coordinate that. Now, somebody's going to tell me, oh, no, it's extremely well coordinated. We know exactly what we're doing. But what actually tends to happen is each region tends to build their own research hubs. And what they tend to do is they tend to sort of try and, it's like a dragon's den type approach. They're all trying to attract investment and investment into their own areas. But there's no national control of it that I can sense. And I think when you add it up, all the universities, all the various agencies out there, I think we'd be far better placed than we realize. But the problem is, it's all lots of small bits of activity. Nobody's really pulling it together and turning it into something, unless a prime picks up on it. But as I think we've already admitted that prime sometimes, they pick up what they want to pick up and they squash what they think is competition. They're not necessarily looking for that really innovative idea. So for me, it is about an industrial defense strategy that genuinely looks across the full landscape and somehow pulls all those threads together, because it's out there. We're just not really bulking it up into what it's capable of doing. That's my view.
Keith, you're the CEO and founder of FASI, AI tech startup. How is it looking from your side of the table?
I think the response to the committee report on AI recently is pretty telling. So Defence came back and said it has 400 AI projects across the whole of the MOD enterprise, and it's quite careful in how it words that. I suspect that some of those we might contest the definition of. I would guess that the number is actually lower than 400, but that's irrelevant. We don't have a single example at scale of how AI has changed warfare. And my contention is the reason we don't have that is because we've never committed to trying to enable it to do so. In almost every other domain of human affairs, we have like knockout examples of how it's totally changed science, material science, for example. Biology is another example. We have it changing trading on the stock exchange. We have, well, I would say this, wouldn't I? It's literally what my company does, but changing how we design strategy for business, government, everyone. We have these knockout examples when people are prepared to invest and really work at it and go for it. And we don't have them in defence because we just don't think the commitment is there. I think there's a really interesting analogy to when we were trying to drive technological change from, the early 1900s onwards and convince the Ministry of Defence, as it then was, that they should use aircraft in war. How did we do it? Well, we did it with competitions. We did it with massive public contributions. We did it by forming flying clubs around the country in order to allow people to do this. And we did it through huge public advocacy with the media. And I wrote about this in the really unfortunately titled article for the Wavell Room. They gave it the title. I did not. I get a chance to put that on the record. Saving the Royal Air Force. That was not what I wanted it to be titled. But nevertheless, my point was that many of today's air power associations were set up precisely because the Ministry of Defence at the time would not adopt these technologies, and so it had to be done between what I've dubbed campaigns, contributions, and contests and clubs. I just think, like, it's Greg referenced earlier how we're seeing play out in Ukraine the early air power history. I feel like we're living the same thing in the UK. We had all the stuff about how the bomber will always get through, so we wouldn't invest in fighters. We had the Spitfire because Lady Houston right at the last minute stepped in to fund the air prize. Otherwise that would never have been developed. So I just think this isn't like, one of the reasons I left government is I don't think defence can reform itself. I'm still strongly of that view. It's only going to happen from outside. And so from where I sit, if you wish to be funded forever with small pilot projects and never scale your company, there's loads of opportunity in defence. If you really want to do something ambitious, it's probably not yet in the UK.
Given your experience, Keith, of being in defence, there's a question here from Jake Sutherland, who basically makes the point that if an adversary, I'm going to combine a couple of questions if I can, but essentially, will the RAF and more NATO forces reorganize their command structure to include fighter groups composed solely of drones and their pilots? I guess it's a bit of a cultural question there, but I'm going to combine it with another one by Martin Bindman, who basically, it's more to Greg, but I think you can answer it as well, Keith, is let's say the UK doesn't do anything, but an adversary decides that they're going to field a whole set of uncrewed systems. Is there a risk that in an operational environment, the pilot in the cockpit is going to get overwhelmed by that? So perhaps start with you, Keith, and then move over to Greg.
Well, I think the second, yes. I think the only way we change is when we start to lose. That's what history teaches us. R.V. Jones at the start of the Second World War, kicking around at Oxford, went on to be one of the architects of our intelligence victory. Asked by, I think it was Lindemann, but it might not have been Lindemann, one of his professors, like, what's going to happen? He asked what's going to happen in the Second World War, like, as the war breaks out, and he was told, there'll be a period of 18 to 24 months where we know nothing but defeat, where all those who've risen above their competence in peacetime are found out, and we will either correct that or we will lose. And I think he the reason he quotes that after the war is it looks remarkably similar to what happened. I don't think you necessarily have to personalize it to say it's the people. I think what was found out was the system that we had developed prior to the war and many of the beliefs that were proved false once war broke out. I think if you look to the Battle of Britain, as I think Greg and I probably always would, what won the Battle of Britain was a system. It was systems thinking, and a 21st century Dowding system would be extremely highly automated. I think the creative element, I mean, at DSEI in 2021, we had a whole stand, I was at Fujitsu at the time, devoted to proving the idea that AI could be creative, and therefore, you know, I think it's T. Lawrence, and then later quoted by Basil Littlehart, that 9/10 of the art of war is knowable and taught in books. Well, that means you can learn it, and an AI can do it. 1/10 is like the flash of the kingfisher's wings. Important thing to know: 9/10 can be learnt, so an AI could have done that then. 1/10 is creative. Nobody would argue that AI can't be creative now, and if they were to, we could lay out another half an hour's worth of evidence that it absolutely can. So I think we would have a 21st century Dowding system would be heavily automated. And yes, we would have those systems. But as you said, combining the questions, we will not get that unless external pressure drives it, or more likely from the rapid feedback loops that the defence only really faces when it has to fight a major war and starts to lose.
Great. I think you've done the classic thing of being on mute.
Yeah, of course I have. Thanks for not saying it. There you go. The you would only hear me ruminating rather than saying any words. Yeah, so the question for me is: imagine NATO now fighting Russia in Ukraine. Do we have the wrong tools to defeat the Russian incursion in Ukraine? I'm not convinced that that's the case. I think the overwhelming effect that NATO would bring to that fight would absolutely have an impact on Russia. Now, whether that would escalate to something else, we can talk separately about that. But I still fundamentally believe that there is nothing Russia is currently doing in Ukraine that frightens me if I was still in uniform. In fact, I've been pretty unimpressed, if I'm honest. And all the talk about some of their systems that were going to be, you know, death rays at 200 miles, have proven rather vulnerable to some relatively low-tech solutions. So the idea that we have been outpaced already and we're already behind the timeline or the drag curve, I don't buy that. We're not going to, and a lot of people who then focus on the fight in Ukraine, saying, you know, 80% of casualties are caused by drones. That's because all our fighting is happening in the 20-kilometer battle zone. Well, that's not maneuver warfare. That's not how we chose to set up NATO with its air power. So there is a question mark here about whether we have gone down the wrong route. Now, China is a different question, and Keith makes some really good points about where they might be going. But you know, I think China is a conflict that we hype up as if it's even viable. It's a very, very different military challenge to take on China than it is to take on Russia, mainly because of the South China Sea. So the idea that actually that war even works in any way, shape, or form is for the birds. And of course, we're always going to have the threat of nuclear escalation at some point, because target number one for me is going to be that factory making 4.5 million drones. That'll be target on minute one, day one. And if he's got 5 of them, then all 5 will be in the target list. So that you have warfare that fights differently than just slugging drones at each other. So I don't think we got the wrong stuff currently. Now, that might be that we're still a bit dated and we could have moved forward, but the enemy hasn't moved forward either. So there's another question there about, well, you only need to be better than the other guy. You don't need to be superhuman and maybe take risks that are not necessary in trying to make a leap. Because in trying to do that, you might make a mistake and you might suddenly be out of date, or you've chosen the wrong route and Russia just comes at you in a different way. So yeah, I think that's the exam question for me. And I trust the MOD. They don't have enough money. We know that, but we war game these scenarios to the nth degree, and we know what works and what doesn't work. And I don't think we would fight Russia as they are currently being fought. So they don't frighten me.
Can I come in, Aaron?
Absolutely.
Okay? I think I agree with everything Greg said. If we had to fight tomorrow, though, I would be more concerned about Russia's EW capabilities and its willingness to tolerate casualties over a long time.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think the fundamental underpinning assumption is that that NATO force we're talking about includes the US. I'm not sure how sound that assumption is. And if it's not sound, we should be thinking really hard about how we can fight within our means in a way that is efficient and effective. It might be that Greg's analysis takes account of no US are still totally confident, nothing to be scared of. But at that point, we would disagree.
It does. But Keith's right. Russia's attitude is different. I'm a Cold War warrior. I used to sit there with the nuclear weapons underneath my aircraft, ready to go nuclear within 5 to 6 days of a conflict with Russia, because that's where it was headed. And that's what stopped us having a fight. And we haven't even talked about deterrence. I've seen there's a few questions here about how do you deter with a box of drones? I mean, I think that's an interesting question. You have to convince the enemy that you've got something that will really work, so don't try anything. Or do you need to fly B-21s up and down their border and sail carriers, 200 miles off their coastline? So but Keith's right. EW and that sort of moral looseness, shall we say, is a concern. But I think we've got the tactics and the capabilities that they have proven woefully inadequate at employing.
Yeah, Greg's right that there's been some interesting questions about deterrence, most of them by anonymous attendees trying to see where the UK and NATO's red lines are. So I don't know who quite is listening into the call, but hopefully Greg's provided a brief answer to that. So before we draw stumps here, I'm going to invite each of the participants to make a 1-minute summary of their reflections on drones. Of course, we have the SDR around the corner. And so the question that they've been asked to ponder about is, what's one priority you'd like to see in the SDR when it comes to drones and future warfare? And Dominica is going to start us off.
Okay, well, I'm gonna state the obvious that drones are gonna stay and they're gonna be like a feature of warfare for the time being, for sure. However, to what extent depends on what we would like them to achieve, and the thing is that thinking about the fact that the air power is less about the platform, because the risk tolerance of losing drones is gone it changed rapidly with the cheaper technology. But I believe that the answer is not matching the adversary tit for tat, but maybe finding a smarter way how to counter these drones, maybe looking into more the electromagnetic spectrum operations and these things. So I would say the drone defenses should not be underestimated. That would be my answer.
All right, you heard it here first. Greg, over to you.
I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I fundamentally agree with that. We've always said, don't fight the last war. Well, the last war for us now is the Ukraine war. And I think we need to think long and hard before we try and shape our armed forces to fight a war we have no desire to fight, and we certainly don't have an appetite for. And that's not taking anything away from Ukraine, who have just been stupendous, and their development as well. But ultimately, that is not the war the West has the stomach to fight. We've got to make sure that we've got the equipment to deter the next one. And it's not about sustainable attrition. It is about overwhelming and devastating effect. And we need to think how that's best delivered, whether it be crewed or uncrewed.
Great, thank you. And finally, Keith.
Would want a commitment to when the MOD forecast we will get to artificial general intelligence, one that matches or exceeds the humans in all domains. Current median estimate is 2026 for weak AGI, 2028 for Oracle AGI, and 2031 for ASI, so one that includes robotics. If the MOD differs from that global forecast, it should be clear. And if it accepts one of those forecasts, and my contention would be that that's the best way to make decisions under uncertainty, and so it should, that would drive a fundamentally different force mix, and the future would be uncrewed, and the future would be much sooner than most people are currently planning.
Okay, well, watch this space. Let's see what the Prime Minister and his team will do. Thank you all for a fascinating and genuinely wide-ranging discussion. I think today's conversation made it really clear that the drones aren't simply an add-on to traditional power. They must be integrated thoughtfully into broader force design. And we've spoken a lot here about the importance of accountability, but also technology, resilience, deterrence a bit. And even if drones aren't considered to be a revolution in aerial warfare, as Professor Phil Sabin, formerly of King's, has written, for a capability 100 years in the making, they might at least be revolutionizing our expectations of what they can accomplish. So thanks again to our brilliant panelists and to you all for joining us and contributing your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but hopefully you found it a useful and illuminating discussion nonetheless. Please keep an eye out for Dominica's new paper that's due to be published on the FASI website tomorrow. And I take this opportunity to wish you all a very good bank holiday weekend. Thank you.